So the last time we had a chat, I mentioned how not everyone is suitable for retreat practice. In fact, it is the case that not everyone is suitable to practice the Vajrayana. Now, many people get the wrong idea when they hear this. They think that these Vajrayanists are very exclusive. And if, in fact, the Mahamudra practice is the most sublime and powerful practice that there is, then why don't you just teach that to everyone? But I've mentioned this point before, and part of the problem is not everyone is up to what's required in order to do this profound practice. For example, not everyone who joins the US military becomes a Navy SEAL. Some people just drive vehicles, work in logistics, or are perhaps ordinary infantrymen. It's likewise the same in education. For example, not everyone gets a PhD. Some people don't even go to university. And so it's like that when it comes to the Vajrayana and when it comes to high practices, for example, like non-duality. But there's another point here, and it's something that is very worth considering. And that is, spiritual practice and meditation can trigger psychotic episodes in the individual, especially if they're not ready for that practice. In fact, some people are totally not ready for intense practice whatsoever. For example, if you experience extreme bipolarity or have manic episodes, then long-term, dedicated meditative practice could trigger a psychotic event. And of course, that's not something we want. And as I said in the previous video, if you're just trying to overcome worldly trauma, then intensive practice might actually make things worse, because intensive practice is challenging. And let's face it, for example, when we're feeling sick, we've got a sore stomach or a flu, then we're not up to doing the things that we would normally do when we're healthy and fit. And so it's the same. If you don't have a baseline of mental stability, then doing long-term practice, intensive practice, could just tip you over the edge, drive you insane, or it could just make things worse. And there are many examples of this in the modern era. I've heard many stories of people who have attended these 10-day Vipassana retreats. Now, these retreats, by all of the reports I've heard, are very positive. But there are many instances of people having psychotic events or otherwise feeling overly challenged. And that's because they're meditating 8 or 12 hours a day and also keeping silence for 10 days in a row. And that's just difficult no matter who you are. And the other thing is, as far as I understand, because I've never done one of these retreats myself, there really isn't any support. So I recently heard of a story of someone who joined one of these 10-day Goenka retreats. And after a few days of silence and hard meditation, he started to become unhinged. He started to question his own mental health. He thought he was going insane. But there was no one to reach out to. And what's more, every time he spoke up, he was told to keep quiet because they were practicing silence. And what's more, if you engage in a long-term retreat, in the Tibetan tradition, for example, you might be locked up for 3 or 4 years. Just imagine being totally cut off from your worldly addictions. These are low-level addictions, things like Netflix, etc. I witnessed this myself when I did a 4-year retreat. After 6 months, most people were reaching out for those things they were habituated to, the things they like to do, even if that's just going out for a drive in your car in the countryside. When you're locked in a room and all you have to do is practice, you are confronted with your own mind and nothing else. And the fact of the matter is, we have very strange minds and a very tricky ego. And the ego will do just about anything to get its way. And so you may think you've entered into retreat with good intentions, but your ego clinging, in the end, could undermine the entire venture. And anyway, you don't want to waste 4 years going into retreat and only come out worse at the end. The fact of the matter is, the individuals who are ready to go into retreat and also who should go into retreat are very rare. In the past, it's not like every single Tibetan went into retreat. But we have this feeling that if you're a Tibetan Buddhist, then along with that comes the necessity of doing a long-term retreat. But the lay Buddhists, the Tibetans themselves, they rarely do this. It's only a small proportion of practitioners, and usually monastics, who do this. It's the same in the Theravadan tradition. They do 3-month retreats twice a year, but it's almost always monastics. And that doesn't mean they're being exclusive. It's not like, well, you're not part of the monastic club, so you can't do retreat. It's not like that. People who become monastics do so because they want to give up their worldly lives. They're turning their back on samsara and looking forward towards progress on the spiritual path. And that takes dedication and a certain amount of intensity. And to be honest, not everyone is up for that. Most of us need a bit of time off. And also, most of us need worldly distractions because we're just not able to focus so intensely for such a long period of time. And also, it's not like you're missing out on something. The way people talk, you'd think that they believed they were being excluded because the good stuff is being given to the inner circle. And people outside, not part of that cabal, aren't allowed to participate. But the truth is, you have to be careful. Up until now, we've done 3 retreats. These are silent retreats, 2 one-week retreats, and a weekend retreat. And soon, we've got our first one-week retreat, silent retreat, happening right here on this property. But to be honest, when I'm vetting people for these retreats, I have to be very careful. Because you don't want somebody who's going to have a psychotic episode joining your group. Not only will that be bad for them, themselves, but also for the other participants. So my advice to you is, before you decide to do any intensive retreat, that you should first check out what your envelope is, what your boundaries are. You should develop some stability and a basic daily practice, and then incrementally increase your meditation, your session times, over a long period. First, you need to make your sessions routine. So you start off with a very short period, something that you can achieve every day. And then, once that becomes habituated, once that becomes spontaneous, then and only then increase your session times. Something that I've noticed is that when people are new to Tibetan Buddhism, then they get a bit carried away. And so they start thinking that they need to meditate 2 hours a day. Let's say, I'm going to get up tomorrow, 5 a.m., and meditate 2 hours a day. And I'll never miss a session. But the problem is, you may be able to sustain that amount of practice for a week or two, but eventually you're going to fall off the wagon. And then you will also be gripped with this feeling of failure. And that's not going to help your path. It's only going to cause you to develop an aversion to practice. And as the Buddha said, then meditation should be joyful at the beginning, in the middle, and in the end. In order to make that the case, then you don't want a lot of obstacles arising, especially severe obstacles, like challenges to your mental health. Now, as far as I know, there have been some recent studies. And the way these studies are interpreted, then one would be led to believe that 20 or 30% of all meditators experience psychotic episodes through their meditation. But in my experience, this is not the case. It only happens when people engage in intensive practice before they're ready. And you would think that people would make a plan or think well before joining a long-term retreat. By that I mean a 3-year retreat or longer. But the sad fact of the matter is, many people do not sufficiently prepare for this. In fact, they don't really know what to expect in the first place. In fact, when I told a friend that I was going to do my first 4-year retreat, they were quite surprised. They thought that I would get bored of doing yoga and having massages and all that time. Truth of the matter is, retreat is not easy. In fact, it's the most challenging thing I've ever done in my life. And I think if I wasn't prepared for that, then I too would have succumbed to mental health issues. And I witnessed this myself in retreat. I witnessed people who entered into retreat before they were ready, and the effect that it had on them. To be quite honest, it can drive you crazy. And several people came out of retreat worse off than when they went in the first place. And that's kind of counterproductive. Another thing you have to understand is what we call a yogic practitioner, somebody who has a high level of realization, often appears to ordinary beings as a madman. If you look at the life stories of the past masters, you would be forgiven for thinking that they were insane. After all, why would somebody do that to themselves? For example, in our retreat, then we weren't allowed to lie in a bed at night. We had to sit in our meditation boxes to sleep in a cross-legged position. And for most people, that just sounds completely insane. I mean, if you're experienced in the spiritual path, if you've heard the stories of the yogic masters, then you won't be that surprised. But for ordinary worldly people, this just sounds like something that a crazy person would do. And as I said, then the realized masters themselves seem to act like crazy people. In fact, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a crazy beggar in the street and an enlightened yogi if we met one. And that's not to say that the goal of meditation is to drive yourself insane. The reason why this is the case is because that yogi's mundane concerns have all become transformed. They've fundamentally changed their outlook on the world and life and reorganized all their priorities. So for example, practitioners like Milarepa no longer had any concern for their own health or well-being. In fact, he meditated in a cave in the snow in the mountains of Tibet with no clothes or food. And you have to admit, that sounds kind of crazy. But as I said before, our goal is not to drive ourselves crazy through our meditation. Our goal is to transform our minds. And when we transform our minds, that means to develop a virtuous mindset. And primarily, that is two things. That is renunciation, or detachment from our desires. And secondly, what we call bodhicitta, or loving kindness and compassion. The transformation of self-concern to concern for others is the cornerstone of all Mahayana practice. And in order to benefit others, then oneself must be on very firm and stable ground. And that means, as an absolute necessity, one needs to have a clean bill of mental health. And that's not to say that people who suffer from mental health issues are not able to practice the Dharma. But they do need to adapt practice to their own particular circumstances. And this is the same. It is the same for all practitioners. The dividing line, the threshold, is not related to one's mental health. The fact of the matter is that we are all different. We all have different dispositions. And because of that, then there are many different methods for traversing the path. Some people are more suited to intense study. In fact, in the Gelugpa tradition, many of these Geshis do not even meditate. They spend all of their time studying. And some people aren't able to study or to meditate, but they can practice through their conduct by applying themselves to altruism and virtue. And if you want your path to be successful, then the best advice I can give to you is first come to know yourself, what your disposition is, and which practices are suitable to your own character. And if you're able to do this, then there's a good chance that your path will be productive. But there's a caveat here, because along with practicing in a way that is conducive to your own constitution, one mustn't just fall into one's natural likes and dislikes. For example, only to practice the things that give you pleasure or that resonate with you. For the vast majority of practitioners, then their practice needs to challenge them. In fact, we need to be challenged. Otherwise, we just fall into spiritual entropy. At the same time, we do not want to be so challenged that we destroy our own minds, that we become unhinged or otherwise to cause obstacles to our physical health. As I said, if you want to help others, you yourself have to be okay first. Not only that, you have to develop some strength and also wisdom and intelligence. Because even though you may have beneficent motivations, if your actions are not embraced by wisdom, the results themselves can be disastrous. And it is my hope that you should make progress on the spiritual path. But if you're going to do that, you have to be intelligent about it. As I said in the previous video, you have to have a plan. And having a plan means to make informed decisions. And in order to make an informed decision, you have to know a little bit about what the methodologies are and what the intended results of practice are as well. Of course, if you're a non-dual zombie, then you have no work to do, because everything is fine just the way it is. But you have to ask yourself the question, is everything actually okay? Or are there things that I experience that I find intolerable or even irritating? The truth is that our view is something that is inherent to our being, is associated with our way of thinking and our constitution. And there is no point in just trying to appropriate the view of another. For example, you may well like the teachings of the Vajrayana or the teachings on non-duality, but you have to be honest with yourself. Are these views in harmony with your own natural view? If you practice intelligently and in a way that is in harmony with your natural constitution and disposition, then as long as you apply yourself, it's almost certain that you will make progress on the spiritual path. And so good luck with your practice. And until next time, see you later.